Test 1 2 3.
Test 1 2 3. Test 1 2 3. Test 1 2 3.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my privilege, my pleasure as principal of college to welcome you to the college and especially to welcome you to the Laidlaw Lecture for 2018 and especially to welcome our guest lecturer, Dr. Sebastian Kim, who will be introduced in greater detail in a few minutes by Professor Charles Fensham. But first of all, let me welcome all of you to this space, to our college, and to this lecture, and also those who are watching via video stream online. We welcome you to this lectureship this afternoon. The Laidlaw Lecture is one of the major academic named lectureships, endowed lectureships in Knox College. It was established in the early 1950s by the Laidlaw family in memory of their father and a brother. Over the years, many have lectured in this lectureship. 2 or 3 years ago, actually 3 years ago in 2015, we had Professor Daryl Guter of Princeton Theological Seminary. In the past, we've had people such as Miroslav Volf from Yale Divinity School, Professor Sally McFaig, one of the leading feminist theologians of our contemporary period, Professor Brevard Childs, an Old Testament scholar, Professor Tom Torrance from Edinburgh, and numbers of others. So this lectureship has a long and a storied history, and we are grateful for the opportunity to bring notable scholars and outstanding leaders, academics, thinkers for this lectureship. And it's one of the ways the college seeks to contribute to the intellectual life of our church and to the wider church community and the community at large. So it is my privilege to welcome you this afternoon. We're in for a rich and deep conversation. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Charles Fensham, who will introduce our lecturer.
So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our guest lecturer, Professor Sebastian Kim. Professor Sebastian Kim joined the Fuller Theological Seminary faculty effective of July 1st, 2017, coming from York St. John University in the UK, where he held the chair in theology and public life in the School of Humanities, Religion, and Philosophy for 12 years. He additionally served as a university head of research and director of the Center for Religion and Society. Prior to joining York St. John University, he was director of the Christianity in Asia project and taught world Christianity in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. He also taught at Union Biblical Seminary in India and was interim director of the Henry Martyn Center and the Henry Martyn Lecturer at Cambridge Theological Foundation. Dr. Kim's scholarship interests include public theology, world Christianity, Asian theologies, and theology and peace building. He has authored 4 books, including A History of Korean Christianity, Theology in the Public Sphere, Public Theology as a Catalyst for Open Debate, In Search of Identity, Debates on Religious Conversion in India, and Christianity as a World Religion. Books he has edited include A Companion to Public Theology, Cosmopolitanism, Religion, and the Public Sphere, Building Communities of Reconciliation, Reflections on the Life and Teaching of Reverend Kyung Chen Han, and Christian Theology in Asia. Professor Kim is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, an executive committee member of the Global Network of Public Theology, a member of the Society for the Study of Theology, and editor of the International Journal of Public Theology. 2 of Professor Kim's monographs, one, A History of Korean Christianity, and the other, Christianity as a World Religion, were co-authored by his wife, Kirstine Kim, Professor of Theology and World Christianity in Fuller School of Intercultural Studies. They are the proud parents of 2 grown children. Dr. Kim has richly enhanced recent debates about the public place of theology in various contexts around the world. In 2016, he was the keynote speaker at the annual meeting of the American Society for Missiology, when he focused in that context on the idea of public missiology in a conversation with public theology. I first met Professor Kim's wife, Kirstine, in 2002 at the Yale Edinburgh Group, and later at the American Society for Missiology when she presented on the book on the history of Christianity in Korea. And in 2016, I had the pleasure of finally meeting Professor Kim himself when he was present at our society for that particular event. We are looking forward with great anticipation to hear his lecture today on this very important topic. Professor Sebastian Kim.
Yes, it is my great privilege to come here and to meet you and also to deliver this lecture. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also thank you for your kind introduction. I'm afraid that I don't have nice pictures. Usually we do have a nice pictures during the lecture. But I will just read out from my notes. And again, this is quite rather long paper, but I would like to read out, and some of them are just to explain what I meant to say. So the title of my lecture is Christianity and Social Justice, the search for the common good from the perspective of public theology. Perhaps the term public theology is not that familiar to the audience here. So I thought of explaining public theology, but rather than spending time to that, I'll leave it to the questions later on. I would like to straight into the topic of justice, social justice, and the public theology. Throughout church history, although the church has often been the side of the state endorsing its policies, Christians have also been among the chief critics in defense of justice for the poor and marginalized. One of the most significant developments of the questions of social justice is the active articulation of the common good in theological circles. Various academic disciplines have recently drawn attention to the problem of determining the common good in democratic societies in the context of what we will call majoritarianism. The relatively new theological discourse of public theology has a dual emphasis on seeking justice and the pursuit of the common good, which could help us in the search for an understanding of the common good that respects minority interests. Public theology can be defined as critical, reflective, and reasoned engagement of theology in the public sphere for the sake of the poor and marginalized. So in this lecture, I shall first discuss some ideas from philosophy and social sciences on what constitutes justice for minorities and the poor in a society. And drawing on this wisdom, I shall discuss how public theology applies to minority rights. And then I shall then develop an approach to the common good in public theology that interacts both secular and theological concepts of the common good and can be implemented in democratic society to protect minorities. So my first point, democracy and the problem of majoritarianism. Democracy is founded on the idea that sovereignty lies with the people, and it is by the far most common form of government in contemporary states around the world. South African public theologian John de Cruz points out that the relationship between Christianity and democracy has been ambiguous in that although he says that Christian faith has provided democratic values, historically, Christianity has often distanced itself from the system. However, he further comments that, especially after the experience of Nazism and Stalinist totalitarianism, most churches regarded democracy as essential to their vision of a just world order. The success of democracy was highlighted in the much-quoted thesis that liberal democracy is the end point of humankind's ideological evolution and the final form of the human government. Although that view, which was most clearly articulated by the Francis Fukuyama, was heavily criticized, most commentators argue that democracy, for all its weaknesses, is still the best political system developed to date. However, there are some difficulties of the democracy, and there are some articles, particularly written in the Economics in 2014. Any democratic society is made up of different groups with a sectional interest. One of the weaknesses of democracy is that when it comes to forming a collective concept of common good and applying it, the view of the majority is determinative, and the opinion of minority is often ignored or suppressed. How to deal with the minority in any society or nation is a vital part of the healthy conduct of the government, but states, whether of liberal or social orientation, often fail to address the issue inadequately. In this lecture, I use minority not primarily in terms of numbers, but as a group of people who are poor, marginalized, and oppressed, or a people who do not have a socio-economic and political power, for example, as in the case of the Minjung in South Korea or Dalit in India. The question is what public theologians can contribute to solving the problem of majoritarianism in democratic systems. To do this, we'll first turn to theories of minority rights and the common good. So my second section is talking about theories of minority rights and the common good in the West, India, and China. How do we maintain the freedom and autonomy of individuals, groups, and nations, and yet protect vulnerable minorities in a democratic society or in a nation? The issue of justice for the minorities and at the same time pursuing of the common good for all in a democratic society has been an important concern for Western philosophers and political scientists. The concept of the common good or common interest, first articulated in the Western philosophy as early as Aristotle in his Politics, has been a central theory since it provides a framework for the relationship between the interest of individual and of community. Recently, the contribution of John Rawls on the issue of justice and the common good is his challenge to John Stuart Mill's use of utilitarian concept of justice, in which the common good was what suited the majority of the members of a society. Rawls saw justice as fairness, which derived by the rational choice of individuals in a fair setting, resulting in a distributive principle which benefits the lesser advantaged. His theory is based on the two aims. First, maximizing of the liberty of the individual, provided it does not impinge on others' freedom. And secondly, providing the advantaged people in the society with the best opportunities possible. His key arguments of fairness as a central component is sharper than notions of righteousness or equality, and which respects to the tensions between freedom and equality. His approach stressed fair process rather than only the result, which encourages participation of all individuals and groups in society. In responding to Rawls, Michael Sanders continues his theme of justice, for which he defines the key issues as first, maximizing welfare, second, respecting freedom, and third, promoting virtue. He points out that reflection is not a solitary pursuit, but a public endeavor, as he sees that we cannot discover the meaning of justice by introspection alone. In his support of Alasdair MacIntyre's virtue ethics and his own pursuit of communitarian concept of justice, he asks how it is possible to acknowledge the moral weight of community while still giving scope to human freedom, and answers by stressing the vital importance of seeking justice in the life of the common good. The key importance of Sanders' argument for our discussion of social justice and the common good is the transformation of the personal morality and social justice, which opens the possibility that religion can play a key role relating to the building of a good society. The problem of injustice requires not only just social structures, but also a change of hearts and change of minds. Sanders arguments that as well as a theoretical pursuit for the concern of concepts of justice and the common good, there must be a moral, ethical, and practical frameworks for the actualization of these ideas into a contemporary society is important in our discussion. While Western discussions on the concept of the common good focuses on the political systems and theoretical concept of justice, Indian thinkers have thought of more in terms of tolerance to accommodate the different communities of India, many of which are defined by faith. Tolerance involves a measure of respect and recognition of the other group. Such respect involves restraint, but does not result in any weakening of certainty, confidence, or commitment to our own beliefs and values. In the early 20th century, Radhakrishnan, the prominent Indian philosopher, challenged Western societies when he portrayed tolerance as a hallmark of Indian tradition and a sign of maturity, and insists that it should be adopted not as a matter of policy or expedience, but as a principle of spiritual life and a duty rather than a concession. He saw tolerance as based on the belief that every community has inalienable rights which others should respect, which should result in equal treatment for others' views. The meaning of tolerance was well articulated in Indian politics, that it is described as at once a pragmatic concept of living together and a philosophic concept of finding truth and goodness in every religion. Indian philosophers' arguments were not only influential at a cultural level, it contributed to the adoption in an independent India of a form of secularism in the context of multicultural and multi-religious society, where the state is called to ensure the equal treatment to various different communities. And discussing different difficulties of recognizing and incorporating minority rights in a state, and also drawing on the Indian model, Bhikkhu Parekh, the political scientist, points out that the minority groups should recognize their identities and also take full account of this into laws and public policies. But many of these face opposition from across the spectrum of political orientations. He discusses the two distinctively different political approaches of redistribution and recognition, and suggests that the best model for dealing with the issues should be an integral approach to the two, since this is the most advantageous. In his proposal of a new theory of justice, he argues that the differing views need to be acknowledged and understood, and that the issues between them are not always issues of justice, but rather to do with the differing values and ideas, and that therefore there is a need to negotiate with each other to seek the common good. Parekh's argument is for a platform for interacting with one another for the pursuit of the common good, and creating a platform on which their voices may be heard is a crucial step in recognizing minorities, and one which public theology seeks to provide. Now, moving into the Chinese tradition, the Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucianism, has developed the idea of Ren, the benevolence. Here, you need to excuse me, please, my pronunciation of Chinese. I will just combine with the Korean pronunciation as well as a kind of literal pronunciation here. The idea of Ren, Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucianism, has developed the idea of Ren to include those beyond the immediate family and clan in the common good, and also reciprocal well-being to promote justifiable benefits for all. And in terms of morality and ethics for the rulers and the common people, Albert Chang argues that the idea of the common good is close to the Chinese social and political philosophy of Dadong, is the great unity or greater community or great harmony, is the Dadong, as found in the Confucian classics and the Dadong Su, the book of great community, written by Kang Yu-wei, is an early 20th century Chinese scholar. And according to Chang, Dadong in Confucian literature indicates the greater good in the contrast of Xiao Gang, that's the lesser good, and that in Dadong society, people care about all members of society and serve the common good instead of seeking primarily to the benefit themselves and their family. This is a society in which the Confucian virtue of Ren, or benevolence, is practiced beyond the immediate family. Chen argues that Kang's vision of a Dadong world is relevant to the contemporary context of socio-economic inequality and global capitalism. It embodied a credible vision of the common good in human society, and he puts forward Kang's concept of benevolence as a persuasive and coherent theoretical framework for the contemporary society beyond the Chinese society. Furthermore, Zhu Wang further argues that Ren is amongst highest goods in human society, since mutual caring and reciprocal networks are vital for mutual flourishing, and because mutual care plays an essential role in the transformation of society. Furthermore, examining the text of Mozi and Maoist philosophy of the 4th and 3rd BCE, Ellen Chang argues that GOEI, the inclusive care, and also GOLI is the reciprocal well-being, are the key concepts in relation to the idea of common good and provides a better understanding of the socio-political framework than Confucian philosophy. For GNI, Chang argues that unlike Confucian philosophy, the Maoist approach moves from general to specific, and from impartial to the partial. In Maoism, the concept of community is wider and more abstract, and the principle of inclusiveness is higher and more transcendent ethics than that of filial piety. So there is various concepts of the Gongpyeong, that's the justifiable equality, and Zhengli, that's the justifiable benefits, and also idea of righteousness, Zheng, and the Yi about justice, and the Gongli, that's the righteousness. The key concept for the Mozi's philosophy was inclusiveness, and the common good was regarded not only as an independent good, but also as an interdependent good. This common good is achieved by the power of authority through the social and institutional contract, and political authority is a necessary condition for social order. So Chang concludes that the Maoist concept of the good provides a more realistic notion of the social justice and fairness, since it is based on the rationality or principle rather than relying on relationships or personal contracts. The philosophical concept of Datong and Ren and in Confucianism, and also the inclusive care and reciprocal care, well-being in Maoism seems to provide both conceptual and methodological insights for situations of inequality and injustice. In particular, Chinese sources stress that in order to achieve the goal of the common good, it is not enough to create a political system, nor rely on the people's goodwill. Instead, they advance a long-term strategy of building virtues that creates a sustainable society because it is in the interest of both ruler and ruled. Jennifer Fries sums up much of this discussion when he writes that the problem of minorities is among the most contested issues in political life because of competing desires for freedom and belonging, especially when it comes to the issues of equality and freedom. Freedom requires autonomy of action and promotes a variety of values, as well as innovation and diversity, whereas belonging requires certain constraints of freedom in order to maintain social relationships and social cohesion and preserve common identity and certain uniformity. The issue of minority rights is not only a matter of tolerance, but also of a positive government action to promote diversity and to affirm the dignity, esteem, and mutual respect of all citizens, whatever their religious, racial, linguistic, and ethnic identities. However, the above discussion of Western, Indian, and Chinese concepts also exhibits that in pursuit of a just society, the notion of the common good, tolerance, or structuring of political system for ensuring the care of the poor and marginalized are not sufficient. Two further elements are needed. First, the understanding of the common good, which benefits society as a whole and pursues justice for minorities is developed through citizenship and active participation of the public sphere. This is based on the notion that society is not a collection of individuals, but is a body with a shared common values and identities and mutual commitment. And that it requires a moral and religious active engagement in politics. The second element is the building of a character and virtue in citizens, because concept of justice and the common good are closely related to ethics and morality. Our discussion has shown the affinity of the philosophical discourse with the Christian theological concept of the dignity of human beings as created in the image of God, and solidarity with the poor and oppressed, and the prophetic advocacy in the public sphere. So here, I would like to turn to public theology for its perspective on the topics of minority rights and the common good. So my third section is public theology applied to minority rights. In his discussion of mainline Protestants, evangelical and Catholic churches in the USA, Martin Marty suggested that together they form a public theology which holds distinctive resources to respond to the challenge of what he identifies as a crisis of morale and mission. He defines public church as a family of apostolic churches with Jesus Christ at the center, which are especially sensitive to the state, to the public order, and the surrounds and includes public faith. Since it is made up of several different confessions, he also describes the public church as a communion of communions, distinguished and yet sharing a common Christian vocation. Marty contrasts his vision of public church with the other ways in which the religious religions organize themselves. There are three kinds of churches he criticizes. One is a totalist, which means a theocentric approach, and tribalist, excludes and self-interest approach, and the privalist is an individualistic approach. Public theology then becomes, in Marty's view, an effort to interpret the life of a people in the light of transcendent reference. Doing public theology or being public church is to exhibit commitment to relate public and private faith to public order. The public church recognizes that it shares traditions, visions, aspects of enlightenment, civil purpose, and transacting philosophies with many of the constitutions and the collegia in the larger civil order. It's a bit too warm, I think. Yeah. The public church contributes to the public discourse out of its own particular revelation and the principles it has developed. Although Marty tends to be over-optimistic about the role of the church in the public life of the USA, Marty's idea of public church and its relationship with the politics and society is helpful and has certainly made a significant impact on the discussion of public theology. He argues historically that each of the three traditions, that is, mainline Protestant, evangelical church, and Catholic churches, has inherently public theologies which have influenced US society over several centuries. public theology was prominent, especially in the evangelical revivals and in the social gospel movement. But particularly since 1960s, especially, public theologies that have been influential globally include Catholic social teaching and statement on social and political issues by the ecumenical movements and the Black theology of the civil rights movement. It has also been prevalent in discussion of religious pluralism and in the Black and feminist theologies in recent years. In the 1980s, the challenge of peace, God's promise, and our response, and also economic justice for all, that's the two pastoral letters, triggered a much discussion within the church and academy on the issue of civil discourse and the ways and means to engage in public life. The dominant themes of public theology in the USA in this period were the role of theology in a democratic polity and Christian social vision and political liberalism. So in this period, the dominant theme was the role of Christianity in the democratic society, Christian social vision, and political liberalism, the significance of church-related social institutions, and the relationship of theological resources to the global economy. So for the discussion on justice for the poor and minorities, public theology draws its argument from the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and Christian traditions, and other various sources, as I mentioned. From this, we can glance to four main insights to the help in our discussion. First, according to Gerard Fonrad, examining the prophetic tradition, quote, there is absolutely no concept in the Old Testament with so central a significance for all the relationships of human life as that of justice. It is the standard not only for man's relationship to God, but also for his relationship to his fellows, the highest value in life, that upon which all life rests when it is properly ordered, unquote. In Christianity and Democracy, John Dekruch distinguished the democratic system, which is constitutional principle and procedures, and the democratic vision, which is the hope for society of equality, freedom, and justice. So in his view, the Christianity helped the system, but Christianity especially contributed decisively to the shaping of the democratic vision throughout its witness to the message of the Hebrew prophets. In order to establish a just world order, which he sees as an ultimate vision for Christianity, John Dekruch argues that the prophetic tradition and vision for social justice for oppressed, poor, and other victims of society, so that all people are equally respected as bearers of God's image. The God of Israel is consistently seen as a God of justice, and his people ought to be just. And the prophetic tradition demonstrated that justice is an ultimate theological concern, and not only upon ultimate moral concern, as they will never insist. And second, the justice is not an equal treatment of all members of the society. As Walter Jimmelli argues, justice in the Hebrew Bible is never blind justitia. It is always understood as an aspect of open-eyed compassion, divine demand for compassion towards the weak and the poor. And Christopher Marshall describes a Christian understanding of justice as a compassionate justice. Though the scripture does not provide a comprehensive theory of justice, but seeking justice is of vital importance, and the scriptures encourages Christians to understand why we should seek justice and how we should understand seeking justice for these minorities and poor. So the importance of why and how is the concern for the scripture writers. Here, the concept of justice in the Hebrew Bible is different from philosophical concept in that it is never an abstract discourse on the nature of justice, but it insists that conditions of the poor and marginalized are under the unjust structure. And justice in the Christian scripture has always been interpreted as the taking care of the victims of unjustice system, including minorities, weak and oppressed. And third, justice is understood as a natural outcome of right relationship with God. In his discussion of Christianity and social justice, Duncan Forrester acknowledges the importance of John Rawls' works. He saw that John Rawls gave a great importance to justice as in the Bible, and justice is what holds together a decent society. And secondly, Rawls affirms and assumes human equality, which is deeply rooted in Judeo-Christian tradition. And thirdly, Rawls' different principles of concepts concern for the least advantage is like the preferential option for the poor of the liberation theology. And then finally, Rawls makes fairness as the key component in justice. However, he further argues that if justice is the first virtue of social institutions, it must be more than fairness. And for Christians, justice is more than fairness. In particular, in Judeo-Christian tradition, justice is understood in relational terms. It is about the proper structure of relationships between God and people and among human beings, and it is primarily and pervasively social. And justice is not a virtue or equality which an individual can have in isolation, but a quality of relationship. The sense of obligation, responsibility, and care that binds people together in society. And justice and righteousness have to interact with each other. And fourthly, fourth point, the importance of Christian praxis is a key aspect of Christian understanding of justice. Edward Schillebeeckx, a Dutch theologian, was attentive to critical theory in his theology. And Schillebeeckx emphasized that the theory and action should come together to enhance the transformation of society, and that the two should mutually inform each other. Schillebeeckx saw that the purely theoretical and philosophical hermeneutics was untenable because understanding can be severely frustrated by social and political structures. And in order to link Christian understanding of faith with social and political existence, Schillebeeckx argued that the knowledge is determined by the interest of the inner bond of praxis and theory, and that the former determines the latter. And in this sense, theology must be the critical theory of the praxis of faith, and the relationship with the praxis forms the inseparable parts of the whole doing theology. So on the basis of above emphasis on social justice for the poor and marginalized, public theology emphasizes the common good for its methodology, as well as the goal of just social order for all. So my final point, public theology and the common good. In his discussion of Christianity and democracy, again, John de Cruci sees the common good as a binding members of society together in mutual accountability and as a process rather than a static set of principles. He argues that it is a necessary vision of a just social order which challenges individualism and promotes the welfare and fulfillment of society as a whole. He insists that the doctrine of common good will provide an important challenge to the possessive individualism, which lies at the heart of liberal democratic capitalism, and to the sacrifice of human rights by social collectivism. He points out that the relationship between power and powerlessness has always been a struggle for democratic theory, and that the church's role is important in keeping those who are in power accountable, and at the same time, empowering those who are weak to exercise their rights for the good of the whole society. He challenges notion that the democratic system will somehow produce morally responsible citizens as a matter of course. Rather, he says that it is a morally formed and empowered who are able to make democracy work. So in terms of public issues of economic and political life in a natural and global setting, Catholic social teaching has been immensely influential on the Catholic communities and beyond, and the concept of the common good is at the very heart of his principle. In the most comprehensive document of Catholic social teaching, the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, published in 2007, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace identified the common good as one of the 4 key principles of the Church's social doctrine, along with human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity. The compendium expands the meaning and primary implication of the common good as follows, quote, "The principle of the common good to which every aspect of social life must be related if it is to attain its fullest meaning, stems from the dignity, unity, and equality of all people. The common good does not consist in the simple sum of the particular goods of each subject of a social entity. Belonging to everyone and to each person, it is and remains common because it is invisible and because only together it is possible to attain it, increase it, and safeguard its effectiveness with regard also to the future," unquote. Furthermore, PCJP insists on the common good as a primary goal of a society and that it has to be achieved together, and it is closely connected to the notion of respect for and integral promotion of fundamental rights. It also asserts that the raison d'etre of the political authority is to further the common good, and that states must ensure the common good by keeping the requirements of justice for individuals and groups within the state. In his discussion of common good, the Catholic ethicist David Hollenbach acknowledged that there is a skepticism about the compatibility of a shared vision of the good life in relation to freedom of individuals, especially in the US politics. The very nature of plural society lies in the fact that people do not agree with each other, and in a political arrangement of tolerance cannot handle the complexity of the conflicting good and justice for each community. Along with Sander, he calls for the forming of public philosophy, which combines commitment to the common good with respect for the equality and freedom of all members of relevant communities. He sees justice as prerequisite for the common good, in that the socio-political system cannot rely on people's goodwill, but it has to have justice with the solidarity toward the poor and marginalized built-in. Hollenbach sees the importance of the strengthening of the commutative justice, by which it means the reciprocal in exchange among the individuals, for example, wage justice, protection of contracts, and so on. But he insists that a more comprehensive system of justice is required. He argues for the three types of justice. One is contributive or general justice, which means the contribution to the common good that justice requires for the individual people. All citizens have duty to help build up of this aspect of social life. And secondly, distributive justice, which means the way members of society share in the goods that their life together makes possible. And thirdly, social justice, the basic structure of society, which connects contributive and distributive justice. As will be apparent, Catholic social teaching arrives at many of the same conclusions about the common good and minority rights, although it draws on a different range of the sources and uses a different method. As you have discussed above, although there are various interpretations of the meaning of the common good, there is some consensus among the church leaders and theologians from the different traditions. First, the purpose of the state or government is the pursuit of the common good. And second, the concept rejects the extremes of individualism and collectivism, otherwise liberal democracy and social democracy, and tries to bring the good of individual and the good of community together. And the third, the common good is regarded as a comprehensive means to organize political life, regardless of political orientations. The importance of the distinction between the common good and public order when it comes to the relationship between law and morality in dealing with the personal behavior seems to be a key issue for practical implementation of the common good. Fourth, the common good implies the challenge from the utilitarian approach of a majoritarian view for the greater happiness of the greater number. It also encourages that the principle that no one should be sacrificed for the sake of the state and for the good of majority. In order to achieve fairness or the common good, it is envisaged that the politics of consensus be used to reach maximum agreement toward the advantage of all such, and in the case of the rule of the law. And fifth, seeking the common good requires parties to persuade communality and relationship. This is more than sums of individual benefits, which is an assumption of welfare state, and more than seeking the good of the shared culture and intrinsic values, which is rooted in the human nature. And sixth, and finally, the common good has to be understood not as an idea which can be readily defined, but rather as a set of responsibilities pertaining to a shared project of which we are all our parties, humanities, share the project of living together. It is regarded as not predetermined, but rather conditions the participation of all for the good of all. Such an understanding of common good brings together systematic, cultural, and moral arguments in the interest of protecting minority interests and works against majoritarianism in the democratic society. Now, I would like to conclude that now. There are problems of understanding of the common good, such as the questions of how to protect of individual rights while seeking the common good. of who should define the common good within the modern plural and secular state, and who says so, on what ground, and in whose interest. Nevertheless, the theology of common good provides alternative approaches to the problem of minorities and makes possible meaningful conversation between liberal democracy and socialist democracy. It is also able to engage philosophies such as those from China and India, which pay great attention to cultural and virtue solutions than those of the modern Western have done. The theology of common good is based on the concept of dignity of human beings, which is grounded in the biblical understanding of human beings as created in the image of God. In order to contribute to promote this dignity, any democratic state should provide mechanisms for the equality and freedom of individuals and create community for the maximum consensus for the common good. In particular, theologians of public theology sees the problem of majoritarianism as situated in the question of monopoly, particularly of the state and market. They advocate the active public engagement of different individuals, groups, and institutions to see that the welfare of the minorities is adequately addressed in a sustainable way. They are utilizing philosophical and political understanding of the importance of public engagement, together with a commitment to universal access and critical debate, to deal with the problem of minorities. On the one hand, they call for the state to acknowledge the vital importance of involving minorities in decision-making, and on the other hand, they urge religious communities to be open and active in social, political, and economic issues pertaining to all and not narrowly focused on their own sectarian interest in society. By doing this, public theologians try to bridge between secular and sacred understandings of contemporary issues. One way of doing this is to bring the tradition of wisdom of Hebrew Bible into wider society in a way that interacts with both secular and sacred resources to address issues and seeks for common solutions to strengthen the statecraft of the democracy. Public theology utilizes advocacy, public debate, and campaigns, and works with the civil societies on various issues, such as poverty and social welfare in policy making. However, it is difficult for public theology to make theological insights heard in secular society, and he has a limited expertise on the various issues. Public theologians may end up creating weak public, which serves to satisfy religious communities for their social obligations, but in reality does not make any of the significant changes and transformation they seek to achieve. The key issue for the public theology is its stance for the minorities and bringing religious insights and resources into the public discussion without being either too exclusive or too inclusive. For those who are doing public theology, there is a clear requirements for a theological, philosophical, and practical rationale and methodology for the furtherance of this approach and for the creative engagement in the public and issues of minorities. Freedom, equality, and the rule of law are indeed key aspirations for the modern nation states, which enable human society to flourish. But society must also deal with the problem of minorities, and this is not just a matter of tolerance, compassion, or charity from the majority, or from those who have authority, wealth, and power. But the system has to provide the least of these. As Hollenbach convincingly argues, the choice today is not between freedom and community, but between a society based on reciprocal respect and solidarity, and a society that leaves many people behind. And this choice will have a powerful effect on the well-being of us all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, Dr. Kim, thank you very much for sharing your insightful paper on the topic at hand. We are going to break for till about 2:45. So if we have refreshments on the side or any other breaks that you'd like to have, so if you could be back at 2:45, I'd very much appreciate it. Thank you. On the web will have. Okay, thank you. you all look much happier now that you're very much refreshed, and I trust those of you who are following on the web being able to refresh yourselves as well. So we are ready to get back into the swing of things, and please have a seat, everyone. Okay. So we are ready to enter phase 2 of the Laidlaw Lectures, which consists of our representative panelists presenting their views. And it will be followed by comments and questionnaires. And at that point, I will go around to pass on the mics to those who are present. Should there be any questions from our web viewers, as you know, you need to send your questions into the email that has been sent out. And if there are many questions out there as well, we will alternate between those who are in here and those who are on the web. So everyone gets a fair share of questions and comments to pass on. So without further ado, our two panelists, if you could come forth and take your positions, and we will commence.
Thank you. And also for those people who are online, if you did not get the notice about the email address, it is also posted on YouTube, I think underneath the YouTube where it has notes. So if you're looking for the email address to send us questions for Professor Kim, please use that email and it'll reach us, and we will put those questions to Professor Kim in a little while. It's my pleasure. My name is Charles Fensham. I teach systematic theology. I have an interest in ecclesiology and mission. So I'll be responding from that perspective. But it is my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Professor Namsoon Song, who will be responding from the perspective of Christian education and youth ministry. Professor Song has been part of the Knox College faculty since the year 2000. Her teaching and preaching is very important to Professor Song, and she finds her faculty position here as an exciting opportunity to work on the educational ministry in the church. She's worked in Knox College, particularly with the Ewart Center and the Center for Asian Canadian Theology and Ministry here at the college. And she brings Eastern philosophy into dialogue with Christian education, theory, and practice, to build a new approach and to seek to reinterpret how Jesus as the teacher taught in his period and time. So also placing Jesus in context. Professor Song has recently received the Louisville Institute grant towards her cutting-edge research on challenges and opportunities for Asian Canadian immigrant churches with first and second generation congregations. And she will respond to Professor Kim now. So welcome to Professor Song.
Thank you, Charles. Social justice, the common good, and public theology are some of the most persistent themes in Christian theology and ethics. They are becoming ever more relevant in our fragmented, individualistic, and liberal democratic capital societies, where various minority groups have rapidly increased due to the growing diaspora, transnationalism, and widespread neoliberalism. Dr. Kim presented and underscored the interconnectedness of these themes and how they are placed in public theology today, especially their role in opening up a channel for discourse and bringing together the philosophies and from the West and the East. I appreciate Dr. Kim's lecture for broadening our perspective with his balanced and engaged approach from the West and the East. His lecture served as a reminder of how Christian education theorized and practiced based on public theology in pursuit of social justice, and the common good. Therefore, I would like to respond to Dr. Kim's lecture, focusing on justice is importance of theory and praxis, particularly in Christian education. In Christian education or religious education or Christian religious education, pursuing for the common good or education for the public is not new. Even though its discipline did not use explicitly the term the common good or public theology. This was my initial response. There have been two different practices in the history of Christian education. One, where church members and the children within the church world should be nurtured. The other, and less known and practiced, where all should be invited and educated for the common good, particularly the socially marginalized and the vulnerable groups, including members of the poor families and visible minorities. These two different practices have been in conflict and have long argued against each other on what should be priority or primary in Christian education or religious education. In Christian education practice, one can begin by referring Luther and Calvin, both of whom are reformers. Since Calvin declared public education for all children, regardless of economic and social status, on May 21 in 1536. Similarly, one can refer to the Sunday school movement in England that began in 1780s, which focused on outreach effort to educate the poorest among the poor. Ever since the Sunday school movement, Christian mission schools proliferated around the world, all in the name of the common good. In religious education theory, one can name a number of historical figures, including George Albert Coe in the early 20th century, who is best known for seeking to build a divine human democracy based on Jesus' teaching of love God and love your neighbor. The contemporary Christian or religious education observed in mainline Protestant churches and Catholic churches, not so much among evangelicals. After publication of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of Oppressed, has been often dealt with social justice in teaching and learning in Christian education. In England, for instance, John Hall proclaimed a mission-shaped prophetic church in pursuit of the common good and social justice for the poor and marginalized. In the US, I would name Laidlaw Lectures and Parker Palmer to his counterpart. In Canada, I would like to give credit to the following Christian educators for seeking the common good and social justice based on public theology. First, Dr. Wang Ying, who is a professor emeritus of Emmanuel College. Because she is a familiar face to on campus, some of us may not have given her the credit she deserves. Dr. Ying believes that we can only love God through loving our neighbor. According to Dr. Ying, Christian religious education is about discipleship toward justice commitment, multicultural consciousness, interfaith coexistence, and global citizenship, thereby developing resources and strategies for multicultural and global multicultural and anti-racist education. She emphasized the solidarity and active engagement with the indigenous cultural traditions and resources in her approach to multicultural education for social transformation. Dr. Ying has challenged the intersection of gender, race, and ethnicity, age, sexuality, cultural, and religious traditions in her articulation of multicultural education. She says, quote, "If this sounds daunting, it could also sound exciting to those who see their vocation as being accompaniers of shared faith journeys with others." Quote ends. The second and equally important educational philosopher in religious education in Canada is Father Mario de Souza, who recently passed away. Just as is the case with Dr. Ying, some of us may not have known about Father de Souza's philosophy of religious education because he had been a familiar face on campus. Father de Souza's education theory was based on philosophy of Jacques Maritain, as he pursued religious education focused on relationship that is vital for the health of a democratic society and the collective striving for the common good. In other words, religious education based on common good of human persons living virtuously, justly, and fairly in a pluralistic society. The common good, not defined in narrow individual and political economic terms or a narrow religious and often fundamentalist sense, but the intellectual, moral, material, and social dimensions. Instead of diversity, not for the diversity's sake, he envisioned diverse levels of human interactions living in harmony beyond political and economic relations alone. In reviewing and reflecting on Christian education practices for the common good, it becomes clear that there are two different practices. One, where the dominant majority or central power group seeks to practice education for the common good, for the sake of status quo. And the other, in which the disenfranchised minority groups seek education for the common good, for the sake of all marginalized groups. The former often lacks a discussion on social justice or avoids it altogether, which causes further avoidance of conversation on social issues and reforms. Such practice emphasizes the enculturation or taming to majority culture, value system, and religious tradition and customs. Sunday school movement and the resulting missionary schools, particularly residential schools for Aboriginal peoples in Canada, are often criticized for giving precedence to enculturation over providing different angles through which to view the truth. In other words, neglecting to teach the truth will set you free. This type of education for the common good is still practiced today, most commonly through the public school systems in which the status quo is preserved through the relevant tradition, history, and power dynamics are reinforced. On the other hand, the latter seeks social justice. Its education claims the equality of all persons, rights of all persons, including the socially marginalized, with an understanding of a commonality in every person, along with a clear recognition and acknowledgement of cultural and physical differences that make us who we are. Despite the outward differences, the sameness in being human is recognized and celebrated, that all human persons are created in the image of God. Although not conventional, a number of contemporary education theorists, including Professor Ying, Father de Sucher, and Dr. Hall, are strong advocates for its practice in the mainline Protestant and Catholic Church. In order to solve social justice from the perspective of public theology, seeking the common good for the marginalized and disenfranchised. The common good here extends beyond social economic materialism as it seeks to pursue the rights, dignity, freedom, and value of all human persons. I would like to pose the following questions to Dr. Kim. Do you believe that it is possible for the dominant majority central power group to seek social justice for the common good on behalf of the poor and marginalized? The second one is, if we assume that seeking the common good on behalf of the poor and the marginalized is necessary for the well-being of the entire society, and not just for the sake of the poor and the marginalized, how can we go about consolidating their different interests? In other words, the common good may hold a different meaning to one marginalized group from another. What can we do to promote solidarity and ease competition among marginalized minority groups? I would like to conclude with chapter 8 from Tao Te Ching, which is a famous Chinese classic, translated by J.H. MacDonald. The supreme good is like water, which benefits all of creation without trying to compete with it. It gathers in unpopular places. Thus, it is like the Tao. The location makes the dwelling good. Depth of understanding makes the mind good. A kind heart makes the giving good. Integrity makes the government good. Accomplishment make your labors good. Proper timing makes a decision good. Only when there is no competition will we all live in peace.
This one alive? So thank you, Professor Song, for your response. Now I'd like to offer a few thoughts from my perspective before we move to questions, and also allow Professor Kim to respond to the important questions that were already posed by Professor Song. Recently, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who is very interested in public theology. And we were talking about a problem that we face in our academic world where the Enlightenment plays such a big role. And that is that we are very heavy on analysis and theory and not so good on what to do with all that when we're done. And I'm afraid I'm going to make that worse with my reflections. So I'm just recognizing that. And Greg Leffel, if you're online, that's comes from you. So what I'd like to say, first of all, is that what I find in Professor Kim's presentation is something that I personally resonate with very strongly. So my comments are not critical. They are supportive, because I think this is a really important piece of work that we need to continue to work on. So in that spirit, what I'm going to do is raise areas of clarification and perhaps areas where additional insight could be reached. I totally agree with those conclusions at the end of the paper about working towards a politics of consensus based on Hollenbach's arguments, etc. I think these are really, really important things. And of course, that we have to do in public theology with working for the sake of the poor and the marginalized in society. You won't find me finding fault with that kind of statement. So what are some of the areas of clarification we can talk about? First of all, I think that it's really laudable the way that Professor Kim has worked on an intercultural global perspective to try and build a sense of consensus around how we work together for the public good. So where our idea of the common good in Christian theology can intersect with other ideas about the public good. And I think there are some areas where we can learn some more about that. And one area that strikes me as I read through his paper is the indigenous cultures in North America and what they have to offer, particularly the idea of all my relations, which moves beyond the sort of androcentric world in which we are trapped as Westerners. We're just thinking of what's good for human beings, but we lose sight of the larger ecological world that we are in. And for indigenous peoples, from indigenous peoples, we learn today how important all my relations are, my relations with the trees and the plants and the animals, as well as all human beings around us. And I think that perspective may also enrich and enhance our understanding of the common good. Coming from Africa, I'm also aware that African cultures often have really important pieces to offer us as we think through these things. And one particular example that strikes me is West African traditions that place a great emphasis on listening. We all know that in kindergarten we work on our listening skills, but often when we get to politics, we don't listen very well to one another. Just watch Parliament on TV, and we see how that goes. So in West African traditions, they have a tradition of listening where the chief meets with the whole tribe, and people sit and everybody gets a chance to speak. And it takes hours and hours and sometimes days for all to speak. And the chief says nothing. The task is to listen. And then finally, the response comes by summarizing all that was heard and responding to it. And maybe that tradition can help us think of how to structure conversations in the public sphere. The other matter I think that is an area of further clarification that would be helpful is also the need to think deeply about how we respond differently in different contexts to the challenge of public conversations, theology, and other players in public spheres and in the publics that we encounter. It was wonderful to see all the references to John DeGruchy. Recently got an honorary DD, honorary doctorate here from Knox College, was our convocation speaker, a very important thinker in this particular area. And of course, he was very involved in my home country, South Africa, in the whole process of the anti-apartheid movement. And much of his reflection is born out of that, based in, and perhaps going back to specifically the Barman Declaration of 1934, and how Christians started speaking up publicly, a public voice in the midst of a system of oppression and darkness in that particular time. So within this Reformed and Lutheran tradition, developed a public theology tradition of protest by means of confession. I think there's something we can learn from that process. In South Africa, of course, that involved the Belhar Confession, which was written in 1982 and later adopted by one of the Dutch Reformed churches in South Africa in 1986, and also the Kairos document in South Africa, both very important confessions that challenge the injustice of society in that particular situation. In our denomination, my own denomination here in Canada, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, in 1954, we adopted something called the Declaration of Faith Concerning Church and Nation. And it was a confession. It's called a subordinate standard in our tradition, but it means it's a confession. It's official doctrine, official teaching of the church. And in that confession, it says that the state has a role to play that we as a church support, and that role is enforcing such laws and policies as will promote the well-being of all its citizens. Now, it doesn't go as far as the other issues that Professor Kim raises around John Rawls's idea of fairness that has to go with equality, and also the idea of relationality. But it's at least outlines the importance of justice for all citizens in our country. So one contextual, you have a, we'll do questions later, okay? So I'm still presenting, so after it, if you keep your question for later, okay? So the other contextual example that I was thinking of when I was reading Professor Kim's paper is Egypt during the revolution. Eldebora Evangelical Presbyterian Church, downtown Cairo, just off Tariq Square, played a really important role in the Egyptian revolution. And they actually chose to support those who were protesting on the square. They supported it by serving them water, sometimes food, opening clinics in the church that cared for people that were hurt during the process of protest that was going on. And they took a public position against the government at that time. And on a Friday, when the Muslim community started their prayers on the square and rocks were being thrown at them, the youth group from that church stood a circle of protection around the praying Muslims as an act of public theology, as an action of public theology. There's much to be learned, I think, from those kind of contextual experiences. So I believe that as we continue on to talk about this, we need to talk about what public theology means, and I would add the public witness of the church in the context of different, in the situation of different contexts. I believe there's some further challenges that we need to face. And I think of this particularly from the point of view of the church. Professor Kim points out that it's complicated. The church and its relationship to public theology is complicated. It's very complex. I think one of the primary challenges we face in North America as a church as we try to speak publicly is the challenge of legitimacy. What legitimacy do public theologians have to speak? On whose behalf do they speak? Do they speak for the whole church or just a part of the church? And so the embeddedness of those of us who want to speak publicly on behalf of the Christian movement and on behalf of the poor and the marginalized becomes an issue. So North American Christianity is deeply divided. People have very different concepts of what is the common good and who are the marginalized and who are those that need to be protected or spoken up for, etc. And so this is a struggle. I know that the Presbyterian Church in Canada, often we have motions that we pass, and we ask the moderator of our denomination to write a letter to the Prime Minister to say something, and often the answer comes back, well, you don't really speak for your whole church because a lot of people in your church disagrees with what you say. So we have this struggle of legitimacy, which is further compounded by the problem of scandals, sexual abuse scandals, and other things that have raised questions about the integrity of Christian communities to speak up. So we have, I think, a lot to learn. Recent research in the United States has shown that the public perception of Christianity for those outside of the church is very negative. The two researchers, Kinnaman and Lyon, I'm just reading a quote from their book. They say, one of the surprising insights from our research is that growing hostility towards Christians is very much a reflection of what outsiders feel they receive from believers. They say their aggression simply matches the oversized, the Christians' aggression simply matches the oversized opinions and egos of Christians. One outsider put it this way: most people I meet assume that Christian means very conservative, entrenched in their thinking, anti-gay, anti-choice, angry, violent, illogical, empire builders. They want to convert everyone, and they generally cannot live peacefully with anyone who doesn't believe what they believe. So with that kind of public image, how do we speak with legitimacy in the public? The second area of challenge I'd like to highlight is that of technology. Changing technology has changed our way of speaking in public. Our public spaces and our publics have been multiplied by the existence of technology. We have a US president who speaks on Twitter. And so what do? We have our traditional ways of writing documents and speaking on behalf or writing letters, but we have a tremendous challenge before us, even as we agree on what the common good is that we work towards, how we speak on behalf of the common good. The media theorist here from University of Toronto, the late media theorist Marshall McLuhan, said the medium is the message. And I think there's a lot of truth to that insight, and we need to work on this particular dimension as well. Thirdly and finally, I think we need to reflect on what we do in relation to multiple marginalities or the intersectionality of interests as we engage the public sphere. So this idea of intersectionality, which comes from Beatrice Potter Webb, a British sociologist, but was made famous by the womanist legal scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, developed this challenge of like my minority and your minority may have clashing rights or clashing demands on the social good. And how do we deal with, for instance, somebody that has a cultural perspective that clashes with a personal identity perspective of somebody else? Both may be marginalized in their own way. And how, as Christians, when we work towards the common good, do we deal with these challenges together? Because we do not agree with each other how we should deal with this. So my questions for Professor Kim is, how we can perhaps work towards responding to some of these challenges. Thank you.
Okay. Our two panelists have presented some excellent viewpoints and questions for Dr. Kim to address. And so without losing the momentum, if Dr. Kim could briefly address the questions that Professor Song and Professor Fensham has addressed. We very much appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your the questions. They are really relevant and important. I very much appreciate that. The first, Dr. Song's approach, yeah, thank you very much for your point about the educations, the religious education and the Christian educations, and also the idea of common good. And I must get the names and also the other people who we mentioned, particularly from the Canadian context, which I can incorporate into my paper. You raised a question about do I believe that the dominant groups can work for the common good for the minority groups and the less powerful people or the marginalized people? And I think the Christian tradition, we have a various different approaches to address this what you call so-called the problem of minorities. One way to look at is the perhaps approach from the liberation theologies and addressing the issue and work with the minorities and poor. So try to change the situation. And then some other groups also working on the various different approaches. And I do think that, yes, the public theology, the approach of public theology is working with the various parties. So the public theologians do respect the approaches of liberation theologians and political theologians working in the kind of grassroots level and working with the poor and so on. But at the same time, the public theologians want to work with the policymakers and politicians to change the policy. Just one example is, let's say, when it comes to the immigrant issues or issue of injustice for the particular group, churches can engage in supporting these groups and helping these people. That's one way of doing it. But also church can engage in policymakers to change the policy and a law and so on, so that to protect these groups and to enhance their welfares. So that's the various different approaches. And I think the public theologians tend to work with these kind of policymakers. That's what also I briefly mentioned about the Nancy Fraser's approach. She talks about weak public and strong public, because Jürgen Habermas was the one, as you know, the one who brought out about this idea of public sphere. He was talking about the development of public sphere in the late 17th century, 18th century, in the Western European context, that really shaped the kind of mature development of the democracy. And I think that's a crucial aspects of the creating public sphere between the politicians and those who are owners and powerful people, and then the ordinary people, and you create public sphere to counterbalance and so on. So the public theologians want to expand that public sphere. And I think recent years, that public sphere has been dominated by the state or market or media. So what I see is the public theologians are working with the NGOs and civil society and the religious communities and churches and also the academia. So the three groups are working together to engage in the public sphere. So I think it should work together and it should challenge. And I think perhaps but the general perception is that perhaps because of the dominant groups, they have their own interest. But I think the idea coming from the Confucian idea and also Moit's, the idea of Moit's idea, that it is important to create a system that the politician, both politicians and the ordinary people feel that they are benefited. And so the idea of common good or common interest that meets both parties. And I think that trying to address that issue is difficult, but I think it's necessary for the sustaining development of the system, because it's not necessary to have, it's not only just necessary to have kind of morality or goodwill. I think the system needs to be supported to have a sustaining a sustenance of that morality and goodwill. I think that's the idea. And also you talked about competition among the minority groups. And I think that's a very a good point, very important point, that yes, of course, people in the different groups, minority groups, have different competitions and their own interests. I think that's what, when we talk about justice issues, we often have various different competing interests. So let's say, for example, in Israel, you have Israeli governments. The justice for Israelis are very can be interpreted as injustice for Palestinians, and also vice versa. So how do you meet this? How do you see the common good in that context? I think that's the one way to address. The public theologians try to use the critical inquiry and open debate. That's the one way, one of the methodologies of public theology, that you constantly negotiate and you constantly seek the common interest, which can be also very difficult. So rather than standing on the one particular sides, but also public theologians try to challenge the idea of many of the Christian groups who are involved in public sphere or politics in order to persuade others for their morality and their ethical issues, like you mentioned about the some of the issues like abortion and also issues about homosexuality and so on. So that's the public theologians do not see that as the kind of agenda that you should pursue, because that can be interpreted by the various different groups for their own the ethical interpretations. I hope I address that. And then the other question about the comments about the enlightenment, and also the about your insights from common good from the indigenous groups, and also people from Africa and various other contexts. I absolutely agree with you that yes, we must get insight from these people, and which is vital for the developing in the public theology. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, the public theology has two dimensions. Yes, of course, we need to develop the theoretical framework, theoretical ideas, but at the same time, how do we practice what we have studied, what we have researched? That's one of the key issues for the public theologians. So I have discussed various different kind of kind of practice of the public theologians. For instance, in the UK, you have a Make Poverty History campaign. That's the group of people Christians come together to challenge the notion of this debt issue in the poorest nations in Africa. And also there are various different movements and campaigns. And also you mentioned about the various documents, various people who challenge the political and social norms. And I think that's a key issue. So in public theology, some people are addressing the more theoretical development, and some people are addressing looking at these various different movements and drawing the wisdom from these movements. Or some people are looking at the what you call public theologians or theologians, people who Christian leaders, Christian theologians, who are relevant to the development of public theology and drawing lessons from that. So that's the quite challenge and important aspect of development of public theology. And I think public theology is a relatively new discourse. And I wouldn't say that that's the kind of replacing, let's say, liberation theology or political theology and other theological discourses. It enhances some other theologians, and together we can develop more comprehensive approaches to the challenge we face. Your question about the legitimacy of the dealing with these issues and also kind of inner differences. And I think that's again, yes, I fully agree with you that that's the struggle that we are facing. And whenever we talk about the prophetic voice, we don't have one voice. Of course, maybe Catholics have some advantage of having the Pope or kind of Vatican voice. That's the kind unified voice, whereas Protestants has a various different approaches, not only just the denominational differences, but within denomination we have various different voices. Nevertheless, I think that's the challenge that we face, that nevertheless we do need to speak out, and it may be different voices, but we do need to speak out and also engage in the public issues, particularly when it comes to the social justice for the marginalized and the poor. And I think if you look at the Loyan Williams lecture, when he gave a lecture in 2008, he talks about the Sharia law, implementing Sharia law into the British law. He was very much criticized at the time by media and the church people and almost every section of the society. But nevertheless, he talks about kind of inclusive pluralism. And I think that's a very important concept that he discussed there. Basically, he argues that as a church, we have a legitimacy to address the injustice in the society. That's what we understand about the gospel. If you understand the gospel properly, that is the mandate is given to the Christians. So I think even though we have different voices, and even if we have a problem of moral issues and so on, but nevertheless, we do need to constantly engage in this situation. I define the public theology as critical, reflective, and reasoned engagement of theology in the public sphere. The critical has this prophetic voice, but reflective has also reflection on our own practice. Therefore, we do need to be humble. And then reasoned has that idea of a reason. In order to engage in modern society, theology should be reasonable and using various philosophies and secular ideas and secular insights in order to come to to bring the common good. And you mentioned about the public sphere and the social media. Yes, I guess that's the challenge we face, and it is important for us to be creative. And I don't know how much time we've got to discuss about that, but I mean, that's very important aspects of engagement. I think the those who are engaged in public theology use various different forms of the social media. And also some of the people are using the art forms and music, and then the drama and so on and so forth to convey the messages. And I think that's the area that creativity is very important for us. And then you talked about intersectionalist kind of challenge. How do we, again, I think it's just similar question about the differences and when it comes to the different understanding of justice and common good. That's the constant challenge that we face. And I thank you very much for your comments.
Okay, thank you once again, Dr. Kim, for your well thought out responses to the comments and questions from our two panel presenters. We're going to open up the questions to those who are present and those on the web. So first from the floor, if anyone has a question or a comment, please raise your hand and I'll bring over the mic. Thank you. Hang on a sec. Yeah. Can you state your name clearly?
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Hi, my name is Gina Bay, and I'm from Emmanuel College, and I am studying PhD at there. So my question will be carrying on with, Dr. Song and Dr. Fensham, which is a great question. And your encouragement of that we, as a marginalized, we must speak up in the public spaces. However, as a woman of color, doubly marginalized, and meaning that first community that have to face with patriarchy, and then the greater society where I have to deal with the race issue, right? So, and but point is that the majority would not give a woman of color a voice. So in order to get the voice, I have to get to the certain point, like certain power or authority or position. And so how does the public theology work with those who don't have a voice? And then one more question is, with that, in light of that, the identity politics and public theology, theology, how that can work together in theological, in academia field.
Thank you. Yes. Dr. Kim, if you could use the other mic.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Thank you for the question. Yes, that's right. I think that many of us do experience kind of double, triple marginalization in the society. It's just not only just women of the color, but also various different sections of society do experience this marginalization. And I think one of the key issues is what we call it is advocacy, that we do need to have collective voices. And I think that's a constant challenge for us to get the collective voices. I think one of the ways to engage in this public sphere is I can give one example. There are so many different examples, but when the issue of the slavery in the UK, the William Wilberforce was known for people who
has made great impact. And he was MP, Member of Parliament in the UK, and he submitted the bill and passed the act eventually. And also many of the evangelical Christians and Quakers were involved in this anti-slavery campaign. But I would like to mention that Thomas Clarkson, who was the academic, but kind of generated the campaign from the kind of scholarly point of view, that he visited various different ports in England, Bristol, Liverpool, and London, and interviewed the captains and crew members and collected data of how the slaves were mistreated and inhumanely treated. So he produced the booklets and pamphlets and so on and distributed. So he more or less kind of led the campaign by generating the public opinions. And I think that's one of the great way to approach the issues that generate the public opinions by, let's say, forming the groups or distributing the various leaflets and the magazines and so on to spread the ideas, because some of the kind of the traditional understanding of, let's say, women and people of color, that may not change immediately, but through the campaign and through the advocacy, that is the important to change the public opinion. So the change of public opinions or advocacy, and also you talk about public education, those kind of areas, that is a combination of those where would change the public opinion and then eventually challenge the status quo. And I think that methodology, in terms of methodology, we have to constantly develop those who are involved in those kind of campaigns. But it is important for us to constantly engage in the issue. The identity issue, again, that's the kind of similar issues. How do we assert our identity, but also to seek the common identities? And that's again, the issues that is complex issue, and we should not just give up because of the assertion of certain identities from various different sections. And I think we need to seek the common identities, not dominated by one particular identity. So.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to move on to a question from one of our online viewers. It's in Korean, so I'll do my best to translate this. It's a kind of a multi-pronged question, and the gentleman asks, or the person asks, in the American spectrum of theology, there are those who are obviously speaking in favor of public theology, but at the same time, those who would differ from that, someone like Stanley Auerhaus could be considered as one person, such person. Now, Stanley Auerhaus was picked by Time magazine in 2001 as one of the most influential theologians of our time. So that being said, is it still fair to say that the notion of common goods holds a strong viewpoint in the American theological arena? That's one part of it. And at the same time, aside from public theologians like yourself, Dr. Kim, who else would you list as, well, others who could be considered as public theologians in the American theological arena? So it's a couple questions in one.
Yes, I think the idea of a common good and also public theology, it has limitations, and I have discussed in my previous book on the limitation of the public theology. As I said before, public theology does not kind of address all the issues and does not replace previous theological discourses. It has certainly limitations, but the kind of consensus politics, and also when it comes to the theological approaches, the idea of critical debate and open inquiry, presented by the Habermas and others, is quite important for us to constantly engage in the democratic setting. Now, the common good, yes, I think there is limitations, and I fully understand that Stanley Habermas' approach or critique on this idea of common good. But nevertheless, I think we do need to address the issue of common good when it comes to the minorities and when it comes to the how do we build up just societies, because that's also many of the concerns the philosophers and various religious leaders and various political scientists. There is a kind of consensus idea that justice is the one which holds society together. We may say, or the Christians may say, that well, the love of God or various other theological terms are the important. But I think when you look at the various different approaches, different academic disciplines, I think justice can be a key word that holds society together. In that sense, and I think the kind of pursuit of common good to achieve the justice is one way to address the issue. And I think, as I presented in my paper, particularly from the Catholic social teaching, on the basis of dignity of God, dignity of human beings, that will give us quite important lessons and also basis to pursue. I think the second question about the public theologians, yes, of course, I'm just one of the number of public theologians, and Elaine Graham from the UK, and also Nico Koopman from the South Africa, the Stellenbosch University, and then Will Storer in the Princeton, and then also the Mark Stackhouse, who is passed about a few years ago from Princeton. Mark Stackhouse is more interested in globalization and economic issues. And then we have what you call Global Network for Public Theology. That's the group of or institutions around the world, about 25, 30 institutions. We have a network, a global network for public theology. And if you Google it, you will soon find it. And then you'll find some of the scholars from that network. We meet every 3 years. And in the kind of global setting, but also we meet every year in kind of regional meetings. So you will find some of the conferences and also speakers from that website.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm just going to swing back to those who are present in this room. Do you have any questions or comments? This room? Okay, there are plenty of other questions from those people who are online. Sung Ran asks, he is a doctoral student also from Emmanuel College at TST. And Sung Ran asks, how can we understand more concretely the concept of reciprocal relationships except through caring of the poor and the marginalized? Can you give us a story or an event that has happened in a global community? How can it be different from a relationship of give and take?
I think that's yes, that's a good question, reciprocal relationships. And I think that's what we do need to understand, that when it comes to the, let's say, poor and marginalized. I understand the question is that the people who have talent or money or power, when they give, what's the reciprocal relationship between those two groups? And I think that's we do need to understand that various different groups have different talents and different gifts from God. Therefore, people in the, let's say, poor country or poor setting, or let's say a difficult context, they may not have things to offer in terms of finance and wealth and other aspects, but they do have their own gifts, spirituality, and also the lessons learned from the difficult situations and so on and so forth. So I think certainly we do learn from each other, and I think that's what's happening in the global setting, that is not only people from poor nations receive things from the West, and I think the people, by interacting with each other, the people in the West or people who are well equipped, well-to-do, also do receive people from the poor setting. And I think that's the beauty of the interactions. So that's why David Bosch talked about the bold humility and also interdependence relationship between the, let's say, so-called the Western world and the non-Western world. I think that's there is certainly we have plenty to give and take.
Thank you once again. As Professor Kim responds to the questions and makes comments, and that may hopefully spur on other questions and comments as well. That was the one more question. Okay. Hang on. Yes.
Going with your response, so I think the approach, I think you mentioned about the approach, the method is different from different fields and disciplines, right? So for feminist theology, we try to empower women. However, in post-colonial perspective, it's about deconstruction, right? So the public theology, the method is it the tolerance, relationship, all those different virtues that you are trying to, is that the method that you are trying to reach in the public theology? Yeah.
Yes, I think that's yeah. I think the public theologians have different understanding of how to approach the addressed issues, and I would say that yes, liberation theology and feminist theology and political theology has tend to be a more revolutionary approach and to see the system as evil and wrong. Let's say the feminist theologians see this hierarchical male-dominated system is wrong, therefore you want to change and address that. And by doing so, I'm not saying all the time, but it tends to be a more revolutionary approach. Whereas public theology tend to be more reforming approach. So the situation is not entirely evil and wrong. So for example, in the democratic setting, you have difficulties and problems. Let's say, for example, Max Stackhouse, when he say the globalization itself, what he says is not entirely wrong. That's the fact of life. We are where we are. Whereas many people who sees the globalization as the system itself is wrong, therefore they wanted to change that system. Now, I think in my understanding of public theology is more we see the system as they are, but we would like to reform within the system. We want to change the policies. We want to change the situation. So the liberation theology may be very effective in the, let's say, 1970s Latin American context, or 1970s and 80s in the South Korean context. But I think when it comes to the democratic context, perhaps public theology has a more effective way to approach. Having said that, we are not, as I said, replacing those approaches, but I think the public theology want to employ the consensus politics and also the kind of critical debate, through the critical debate and advocacy that you want to change policies.
Okay. Thank you. Swinging back to the web question, this question asks, and it's related to Professor Song's second question, that is, if there would be a conflict among the poor and the marginalized, what and how can we solve this conflict according to the justice that Professor Kim has suggested?
Yes, I think that's quite a difficult question, and you have a conflicting interests, and so I think the important is that you don't side with a particular group, and but constantly engage in negotiations. But having said that, as I said, the public theology stands for the marginalized and poor and the weaker section of society, and also the similarly is talking about the biblical understanding of justice is not just the equal treatment to all the parties, and I think there is understanding of preferential option for the poor and marginalized. In other words, biblical understanding always have that the compassion toward people or the poor and the marginalized. So you do need to address issues in understanding that you give more preferential preferential treatment. So if I may say, let's say when it comes to the Palestinian issues, I think we do need to look into the situation of the Palestinians more sympathetically, if I may say, and see the situation and negotiate on the basis of that.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. So maybe one or two questions more. Anyone else from the floor that'd like to add a comment or a question to perhaps what has been spoken or already added? No?
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Your presentation on the common good for the sake of justice, I think, is very appreciated, particularly within the Reformed churches. My concern is with respect to those who don't necessarily belong to the Reformed tradition, churches, parachurch organizations, and so on. And this is for the North American landscape. In our liberal democracy, there is a cacophony of voices in the public square. They're competing to have their positions and their policies to be implemented. And so not only do we have an obligation to advocate for the common good in terms of justice, but I think the problem that we run into is that there is multiple understandings of justice, and the main sources that you proposed, John Rawls and Michael Sandel, there are multiple understandings of what justice is. And so how do we, John Rawls talks about, I think I don't remember the exact term, but he talks about what's universally acceptable discourse within the public sphere. And so that's a challenge for the church to communicate what we want in a way that, as you say, can advocate for the poor, for the common good. But we have other groups that are also claiming that same privileged status within that public sphere. And so how can we get that message across? How can the church show itself, show its own voice, propose a theology that is good for the sake of justice, but in a way that takes into consideration that there are other competing voices that are claiming that same privileged status. Even some Christian groups whose goals may be diametrically opposed to the common good for the sake of the poor, they may not be interested in the poor. They may just be interested in kind of advancing their own agenda through their own advocacy and so on. So how do we get our voice across in an effective manner within our liberal democracy in the public sphere?
Thank you again for a good question. Yes, of course, that's again difficult to discern. And I think the churches, of course, is not kind of advocacy group, or churches is different from NGOs. So we cannot just involved in every single issues. And I think we do need to discern what is the important issues, and also we need to be selective of our engagement. And I would say the issue of the poor and marginalized and the victims of the society and the systems, that could be a priorities. Now, when it comes to the competing interest of the different groups, as I said, we cannot just simply involve in every single issues, because each groups want to involve in the public sphere. I think as a denomination, as a church body or synod and so on, need to decide which one is the urgent issues for that particular church and denomination to be involved in. But also each congregation needs to discern what are the most important pressing issues and what are the issues that we can possibly engage in, and also in the kind of limited resource they have, how can they use that limited resources for the effective engagement. So that much probably I can say that because we have limited resources and we have limited expertise on the every single issues. Therefore, congregation and denomination and various different groups, Christian groups, need to decide what is the priorities. I don't know whether it's the answers to your question.
Okay. Thank you. It's percolated a lot of other thoughts in our minds. I think we're at a good point of saying a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Sebastian Kim from Fuller Theological Seminary. These past few days have been very enriching, challenging, and promising in terms of the direction in which our theological endeavor is taking us. So thank you for entertaining us with many presentations, Dr. Kim, and of course, entertaining many questions, both present here and on the web, and for your participation in this event. But before I say adieu, we have at the back of this room a table displayed of Dr. Kim's publications and other works. So please have a look before you go. Without further ado, please give Dr. Kim a welcome applause. Thank you.
Just before we are dismissed, let me just add my own word of thanks, certainly to Dr. Kim. This has been a rich, deep, and broad conversation. I also want to thank, on behalf of all of us, Professor Fensham and Professor Song for their contribution and for raising important questions. So let's express our thanks to them. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and the committee that's been involved in organizing this, and Dr. Dong-Ha Kim and others who have worked hard to make this happen, and to the Laidlaw family for their continuing support of this important lectureship. Thank you.